Sarah pressed her fingers against the elderly man's wrist, counting his pulse in the darkness of the private recovery room, when she heard the woman who was about to marry his son whisper into her phone. "Don't worry, Marcus. 6 more weeks of the wrong medication and the old man's heart will give out naturally. Then David inherits everything, we get married, and 18 months later I'm walking away with $40 million. Sarah's hand froze. The pulse beneath her fingers continued its steady rhythm, but her own heart had stopped entirely. Now seat back, grab your popcorn, and ride along with me. Her name was Sarah Johnson, 47 years old, a night shift nurse at Sunrise Springs Rehabilitation Center in Scottsdale, Arizona, where the rooms cost $3,000 a day and the patients arrived in limousines with leather interiors that smelled like wealth and antiseptic. She had been a nurse for 23 years, her hands steady through codes and crises, her back permanently curved from years of lifting patients who could not lift themselves, her feet aching in shoes she replaced every 6 months when the soles wore through from 12-hour shifts walking hospital corridors that stretched like endless highways. It was 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, and the rehabilitation center was silent except for the mechanical whisper of oxygen machines and the distant beep of heart monitors. Sarah had been checking on Mr. Harrison Whitmore, 78 years old, recovering from a stroke that had left his right side weak and his speech slurred, but his mind sharp as ever. She had just finished recording his vital signs, normal, stable, improving, when she heard the voice drifting from the family consultation room across the hall. The door was cracked open, a sliver of light cutting across the polished floor, and through that gap came the voice of Victoria Sterling. Beautiful, poised Victoria, 32 years old, with honey blonde hair that fell in perfect waves and a smile that could convince anyone of anything. Victoria, who had appeared in David Whitmore's life 6 months ago like something out of a fairy tale, sweeping the lonely 45-year-old tech consultant off his feet with attention and affection that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Victoria, who visited Harrison every day, bringing flowers and magazines, sitting by his bedside with a concerned expression that looked rehearsed, asking doctors careful questions about his medications, his prognosis, his recovery timeline. Victoria, who was standing in that consultation room at 3 in the morning, speaking to someone named Marcus in a voice stripped of all its usual warmth. Sarah should have walked away, should have finished her rounds, should have returned to the nurse's station, should have minded her own business the way 23 years in healthcare had taught her to do. But something in Victoria's tone, something cold and calculated, rooted Sarah's feet to the floor. "The pharmacist switched his blood pressure medication like we discussed," Victoria continued, her voice low but clear. "Dr. Reeves doesn't even check anymore. He just signs off on whatever I suggest since I've been so involved in Harrison's care. David thinks I'm being a devoted future daughter-in-law. He has no idea I'm increasing the dosage every week." Sarah's breath caught. She pressed herself against the wall outside the consultation room, her nurse's uniform suddenly too tight, her vision tunneling. "Marcus, baby, listen to me." Victoria's voice took on an edge of impatience. "I've spent 6 months playing the perfect girlfriend. 6 months of listening to David's boring stories about coding and software development. 6 months of pretending to care about his father's recovery. 6 months of this performance, and it's finally paying off." There was a pause, presumably while Marcus responded on the other end of the call. "Of course I don't love him," Victoria laughed, and the sound was like ice cracking. "David is a means to an end, a very wealthy end. His father built a medical device company worth $80 million before he sold it. David inherited half when his mother died, and he'll inherit Harrison's half when the old man finally dies. $40 million, Marcus. $40 million that will be in David's account, and then in our account when I become Mrs. Whitmore." Sarah's legs trembled. She looked back at Harrison's room, at the man sleeping peacefully, trusting that the medications keeping him alive were helping rather than slowly killing him. "The timeline is perfect," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the organized tone of someone reviewing a business plan. Harrison's stroke was a gift. Nobody questions medications for stroke patients. The doctors expect complications, expect setbacks. If his heart gives out in the next month or two, it'll be chalked up to his age and condition. Natural causes. Clean, untraceable, perfect. Another pause. Then I marry David. I've already got him convinced we should do it quickly, quietly, while he's still grieving. He thinks I'm being sensitive to his loss. Really, I just want legal access to the inheritance as fast as possible. Arizona community property laws mean the moment we're married, half of everything becomes mine. Sarah pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. The wall was cold against her back, and she could feel her pulse hammering in her throat. 18 months, Victoria said, and now her voice held a smile. That's how long I need to stay married to make the divorce settlement ironclad. 18 months of playing the devoted wife, and then I file. Irreconcilable differences. With a good lawyer and Arizona's laws, I'll walk away with at least 20 million, probably more. David's too trusting to have made me sign a prenup. He actually teared up when he proposed. Can you believe it? He thinks this is real. Sarah heard movement, heels clicking against tile. Then you and I take our 20 million and disappear, Marcus. The villa in Portugal like we planned. Or maybe Argentina. Somewhere without extradition treaties, just in case. We'll have enough money to live like royalty for the rest of our lives, and David Whitmore will be exactly where he started, alone and heartbroken, except this time he'll also be broke. The cruelty in Victoria's voice was breathtaking. Sarah had heard many things in her years as a nurse, had witnessed family fights over inheritances, had seen the worst of human nature in hospital waiting rooms. But this calculated, this cold, this evil, this was something else entirely. I have to go, Victoria said suddenly. The night nurse does rounds about now, and I can't be seen on the phone at this hour. It would raise questions. I'll call you tomorrow. Love you, baby. Think about Portugal. The call ended. Sarah heard the rustle of fabric, the click of a purse closing. She moved quickly, silently, years of night shifts teaching her how to walk without sound. She was 10 feet down the hallway, pretending to check a medication cart, when Victoria emerged from the consultation room. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Victoria's face was composed, pleasant, giving nothing away. Oh, Sarah, you're still here. I couldn't sleep, so I came to sit with Harrison for a bit. He's been on my mind. The lie was delivered with perfect sincerity, with concern and warmth that would have fooled anyone who hadn't just heard the truth. That's very kind of you, Miss Sterling, Sarah managed, her voice somehow steady despite the earthquake inside her chest. Mr. Whitmore is lucky to have you caring so much. I'll be family soon, Victoria smiled, and the smile was radiant and empty. I want to be there for both of them. She walked past Sarah, her perfume expensive and cloying, and disappeared down the corridor toward the exit. Sarah stood frozen until she heard the elevator doors close, and then her legs gave out. She sank into the chair at the nurse's station, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. The computer screen in front of her displayed Harrison Whitmore's chart, his medications, his vitals, his recovery plan. Everything looked normal, professional, appropriate, except it wasn't. Except someone was using those medications to murder him slowly, carefully, in a way that would look like natural causes. Before we continue with this story, please subscribe to this channel and like this video so more people can hear this tale. Now, let us continue. Sarah had grown up in Sacramento, California, the daughter of Filipino immigrants who had worked 3 jobs between them to keep their family fed. Her father had been a janitor at a high school, her mother a seamstress in a factory that made wedding dresses for women who would never notice the hands that stitched the seams. Sarah had been 12 when her father died of a heart attack on the school floor he was mopping, his body found by a teacher the next morning. She had been 16 when her mother's eyesight began to fail from years of close work in poor lighting, forcing her retirement with no pension and no savings. Sarah had put herself through nursing school by working nights at a convenience store, studying between customers, sleeping 4 hours a night for 3 years. She had graduated with honors and $30,000 in student loans that took her 15 years to pay off. She had married at 25, divorced at 30 when she discovered her husband had gambled away their savings. She had raised her daughter alone, working double shifts, missing school plays and birthdays, choosing between groceries and utility bills. Her daughter Angela was now 23, working as a teacher in Phoenix and Sarah's greatest pride. But Angela was also diabetic, type 1, diagnosed at 15, and her insulin cost $800 a month even with insurance. Sarah sent her $400 every month to help cover it. Money that came from overtime shifts and skipped meals and walking to work instead of driving to save gas. Sarah lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Mesa, 20 miles from Sunrise Springs, in a complex where the air conditioning barely worked and the carpet was stained by previous tenants she would never meet. Her furniture came from thrift stores, her clothes from clearance racks, and her one luxury was a coffee maker that she had bought herself for her 40th birthday. She had $400 in her savings account, money she was trying not to touch, saving for the inevitable emergency that always seemed to arrive just when she thought she was getting ahead. She worked at Sunrise Springs because it paid $3 more per hour than the county hospital, and because the night shift differential meant she could earn enough to survive and help Angela. She had been working there for 7 years, had cared for hundreds of patients. Wealthy people recovering from surgeries and strokes and accidents. People who would return to mansions and vacation homes and lives Sarah could barely imagine. She had learned to be invisible in those rooms, to provide care without inserting herself into the narratives of the wealthy. She had learned that rich people talked freely in front of nurses as if healthcare workers were furniture, incapable of understanding or remembering what they heard. She had learned that there was a line, invisible but absolute, between those who could afford $3,000 a day care and those who provided it. And she had learned to accept that line, to stay on her side of it, to do her job and go home and survive another day. But now, sitting at the nurse's station with Victoria Sterling's words echoing in her mind, Sarah faced something she had never encountered before. Knowledge that could save a life or destroy her own. A choice between speaking and surviving. Harrison Whitmore was a patient, just one of many she would care for in her career. But Harrison Whitmore was also a man who smiled when she checked on him at night, who thanked her even when speech was difficult, who showed her pictures of his late wife and told stories about building his company from nothing. A man who trusted his son, who was proud of David's kindness and integrity, who had told Sarah just last week that Victoria was the best thing that ever happened to David. A man who was being murdered and didn't know it. David Whitmore came to visit his father every morning at 7 before heading to his office. Sarah had met him dozens of times during shift overlap. He was quiet, serious, with kind eyes and an awkward politeness that suggested someone unused to casual conversation. He brought his father books and crossword puzzles, sat by the bed reading aloud when Harrison was too tired to hold a book himself. He spoke about Victoria with a wonder that bordered on disbelief, as if he couldn't quite accept that someone so beautiful would choose someone so ordinary. "I never thought I'd get married," he had told Sarah once, while waiting for his father to return from physical therapy. "I'm not exactly the romantic hero type, but Victoria, she sees something in me. She makes me believe I could be better than I am." The memory made Sarah's stomach turn. David had no idea. He was walking into a trap constructed with smiles and lies, was about to lose his father and then his fortune, and then his faith in love itself. And Victoria had engineered it all with the precision of a surgeon, cutting away his defenses, his skepticism, his protection. Sarah's hands were still shaking. She pulled out her phone and stared at it, trying to decide what to do. Call the police? And tell them what? That she overheard a conversation that could be interpreted as dark humor or venting? Without proof, without evidence, she had nothing but her word against Victoria's, and she knew whose word would carry more weight. Tell David, a man she barely knew, whose life revolved around the woman who was deceiving him? He would think she was crazy or jealous or trying to cause trouble. Victoria would deny everything, would twist the narrative, would make Sarah the villain. And Sarah would lose her job, would lose the income that kept Angela in insulin, would lose everything. Tell the doctors? They would check the medications, find them properly prescribed, properly administered. Victoria had been clever, working within the system, making changes that looked reasonable, justifiable. Without evidence of intention, there was nothing obviously wrong. Sarah could stay silent, could finish her shift, could go home, could pretend she heard nothing. Harrison Whitmore would die in a few weeks, his death attributed to complications from his stroke. David would grieve and marry Victoria and lose everything, and Sarah would have been complicit through her silence, would carry the weight of that choice for the rest of her life. She thought of her mother, who used to tell her in Tagalog, "Kung hindi ka tutulong sa nangangailangan, sino ang tutulong sa'yo? If you don't help those in need, who will help you?" She thought of her daughter, who had become a teacher because she wanted to protect children, to stand between them and harm. Angela, who had learned from watching Sarah that doing the right thing mattered, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. She thought of her father, who had died mopping floors, who had taken pride in his work, who had taught Sarah that dignity came from integrity, not wealth. And she thought of Harrison Whitmore, sleeping in room 304, trusting that the people caring for him wanted him to live. Sarah took a deep breath. Her hands stopped shaking. A terrible calm settled over her, the same calm she felt during medical emergencies, when panic would mean death and steadiness meant survival. She knew what she had to do, even though it terrified her. She knew the cost, and she knew she would pay it anyway. She would find proof. She would document everything. She would protect Harrison Whitmore and David Whitmore from the woman destroying them. And she would do it knowing that the attempt might destroy her instead. But she would do it, because 23 years as a nurse had taught her that saving lives was not just a job, it was a calling. And some callings demanded everything. Sarah opened Harrison Whitmore's digital chart and began to read every entry from the past 6 months, looking for the fingerprints of murder hidden in routine care. The night stretched ahead of her, dark and full of danger, and for the first time in 7 years, Sarah Johnson stepped across the invisible line that separated those who survived from those who fought. The next morning, Sarah did not go home. She sat in her car in the employee parking lot as the sun rose over Scottsdale, turning the desert sky pink and gold, and she made a list on the back of a patient care checklist. Everything she knew, everything she needed to prove, everything that could go wrong. Victoria was manipulating Harrison's medications. That was the core of it. But Sarah needed to prove intention, needed to show a pattern, needed evidence that would be undeniable even to people predisposed not to believe her. She drove to the public library, exhaustion blurring her vision, and used the computers to research Arizona law on medical fraud, on inheritance, on community property. She learned that medication errors were difficult to prosecute without proof of intent, that family members had broad latitude in medical decisions, that circumstantial evidence meant nothing without documentation. She learned she was fighting a system designed to protect exactly the kind of deception Victoria was committing. But she also learned that pharmacies kept records, that prescription changes required authorization, that a pattern of modifications could demonstrate intent if someone knew where to look. Sarah returned to Sunrise Springs that night with a plan. She would photograph every medication change in Harrison's chart, would cross-reference them with Victoria's visits, would document the correlation. She would record times and dates, would note conversations between Victoria and the doctors, would build a timeline that showed the systematic manipulation. It took her 3 weeks of working her regular 12-hour shifts and then staying late, hiding in medication rooms and empty patient rooms, using her phone to photograph computer screens, writing notes in a composition book she kept hidden in her locker. 3 weeks of watching Victoria perform her role, bringing Harrison flowers, holding David's hand, smiling at nurses and doctors with perfect warmth. 3 weeks of watching Harrison Whitmore deteriorate, His blood pressure became erratic, swinging from dangerously high to dangerously low. He complained of dizziness, of chest pain, of exhaustion that kept him in bed even when physical therapy came. The doctors adjusted his medications again and again, always following Victoria's gentle suggestions, never suspecting that the concerned almost daughter-in-law was the source of the problems she claimed to want solved. Sarah watched David's face grow haggard with worry, watched him hold his father's hand and whisper prayers Sarah could hear from the hallway, watched him lean on Victoria, grateful for her support, trusting her completely. And Sarah said nothing, because she had no proof yet, because speaking too soon would mean being dismissed, silenced, destroyed before she could help anyone. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her scrubs hanging loose on a frame already too thin. She developed a tremor in her left hand from stress and exhaustion, had to grip her coffee cup with both hands to keep it steady. She snapped at a colleague for the first time in 7 years, then apologized with tears in her eyes, horrified at herself. Angela called, worried. "Mom, you sound exhausted. Are you okay?" "Just busy, anak," Sarah lied, using the Tagalog word for child. "You know how it is." "You're working too hard," Angela said. "You need to rest." "I will," Sarah promised, knowing she wouldn't, knowing she couldn't, not until this was finished. On a Wednesday afternoon, Sarah's 21st day of documentation, she finally found what she needed. A prescription change authorization form in the system, digitally signed by Dr. Reeves, but flagged by the pharmacy with a question about dosage. The note from the pharmacist, small and easy to miss, read, "Dosage increase inconsistent with patient weight and kidney function. Recommend review." Dr. Reeves had overridden the concern with a single sentence. "Family preference for aggressive treatment. Approved per discussion with Victoria Sterling." Family preference. Victoria wasn't family, wasn't medically trained, had no legal authority to make treatment decisions. But Dr. Reeves, busy and trusting and impressed by Victoria's devoted attention, had given her input weight she shouldn't have had. And there, in that pharmacy flag and that override, was the crack in Victoria's perfect facade. Evidence that her involvement had pushed Harrison's treatment beyond medical recommendation into dangerous territory. Sarah photographed the screen, her hands shaking so badly she had to take 3 pictures to get one in focus. She printed the form, hiding it in her bag, and then she went to the one person she thought might listen. Margaret Ortiz, the director of nursing, had been at Sunrise Springs for 15 years. She was 62 years old, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, with a reputation for protecting her nurses and holding doctors accountable. If anyone would take Sarah seriously, it would be Margaret. Sarah requested a meeting, citing patient safety concerns. Margaret agreed immediately, her face already worried. They met in Margaret's office at 7 in the morning, before the day shift chaos began. Sarah brought her composition book, her photographs, her timeline, and she told Margaret everything. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with every revelation. When Sarah finished, the silence stretched long and terrible. "This is very serious, Sarah," Margaret said finally. "These are criminal accusations against a patient's family member. If you're wrong, if this is misunderstood or misinterpreted, you could lose your license. You could be sued for defamation. This could destroy your career." "I know," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. "But if I'm right and I do nothing, Harrison Whitmore dies. And then David Whitmore loses everything. I can't live with that, Margaret. I can't be the person who stayed silent." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Show me everything." They went through Sarah's documentation piece by piece. The medication changes, each one small enough to seem reasonable but together forming a pattern. The pharmacy flags that had been overridden. The correlation between Victoria's visits and prescription adjustments. The timeline showing Harrison's decline accelerating exactly when Victoria increased her involvement in his care. Margaret's face grew pale. "Dear God," she whispered, "this is real. This is actually happening." "What do we do?" Sarah asked. Margaret stood, her decision made. We go to administration. We report this to the medical board. We contact the police. And we protect Harrison Whitmore starting right now. The next 12 hours moved with the speed and chaos of a code blue. Margaret brought the evidence to the center's medical director, who called an emergency meeting with Dr. Reeves and the pharmacy director. They reviewed Harrison's chart, brought in a toxicologist to analyze the medication combinations, verified every detail Sarah had documented. Dr. Reeves turned gray as he realized he had been manipulated, that his trust had been weaponized, that he had nearly been complicit in killing a patient. The police were called. Detectives arrived, taking statements, photographing evidence, treating Harrison's room like a crime scene. Hospital security was instructed not to allow Victoria Sterling into the building. And at 2 in the afternoon, while Victoria was meeting with a wedding planner to discuss centerpieces, detectives knocked on her apartment door with a warrant for her arrest. The phone call came to David Whitmore while he sat in a meeting, reviewing code with his development team. The detective's words made no sense at first. Medical fraud, attempted murder, conspiracy, the woman he loved, the woman he was supposed to marry in 3 weeks, was being arrested. David arrived at Sunrise Springs in a daze, his face the color of old paper. Margaret Ortiz met him in the lobby, Sarah standing behind her, silent and terrified. "I don't understand," David kept saying. "This has to be a mistake. Victoria loves my father. She loves me. This can't be real." Margaret handed him the printed documentation, the timeline, the evidence that painted a picture of systematic deception and calculated cruelty. David read in silence, his hands beginning to shake, his breathing growing shallow. When he finished, he looked up at Sarah. "You discovered this? You reported this?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "Why?" David's voice cracked. "You could have lost everything. Why would you risk that for us? You barely know us." "Because it was right," Sarah said simply. "Because your father deserves to live. Because you deserve the truth. Because I'm a nurse, and protecting patients is what I do, even when it's terrifying." David's face crumpled. He sat down heavily in a waiting room chair, buried his face in his hands, and wept. Sarah stood awkwardly, not knowing if she should offer comfort or leave him to his grief. But then David looked up, tears streaming down his face, and said, "Thank you. I will never be able to thank you enough. But thank you." The investigation moved quickly once it started. Police found text messages between Victoria and Marcus Chen, a man with no relation to Sarah, detailing their entire scheme. They found research on Harrison's medical condition, on medication interactions, on how to cause cardiac events that would appear natural. They found bank statements showing Victoria and Marcus had been planning this for over a year, had targeted David specifically after researching his family wealth. Marcus was arrested in San Diego, where he had been waiting for Victoria's call that Harrison had died. The villa in Portugal they had planned to buy was identified, the real estate agent cooperating with authorities. Victoria's lawyer argued that the text messages were fantasy, that she never actually intended to go through with anything. But the pharmacy records, the medication changes, the documented pattern of increasing dosages beyond medical recommendation, all of it together painted an undeniable picture of attempted murder. She was charged with attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. Bail was set at $5 million, which neither she nor Marcus could pay. They remained in county jail while the case built against them. Harrison Whitmore's medications were corrected immediately. Within 3 days, his blood pressure stabilized. Within a week, he was stronger, more alert, able to sit up without dizziness. Within 2 weeks, he was walking short distances with a cane, his speech improving, his mind clear. When doctors told him what had been happening, what Victoria had been doing, he was silent for a long time. Then he asked to speak with Sarah. She came to his room nervously, not sure what to expect. Harrison was sitting up in bed looking more like himself than he had in months. David stood beside him, his hand on his father's shoulder. "Miss Johnson," Harrison said, his speech still slightly slurred but understandable. "They tell me you saved my life." "I just did my job, Mr. Whitmore," Sarah said quietly. No, David interrupted, his voice firm. You did far more than your job. You risked everything. Your career, your income, your safety. You did that for my father, for me, for people you had no obligation to protect beyond professional duty. That's not just doing a job, that's courage. That's heroism. Harrison nodded. My son is right, and we want to thank you properly. I don't need thanks, Sarah said quickly, uncomfortable with the attention, with the praise. I'm just glad you're okay. Nevertheless, Harrison said, and reached for an envelope on his bedside table. David handed it to him, and Harrison held it out to Sarah. This is not payment. You cannot pay someone for saving a life. This is gratitude, and it comes with a request. Sarah took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a check for $50,000. Her vision blurred. She looked up, speechless, her mind unable to process the number. That's not all, David said gently. My father and I have discussed this extensively. We want to establish a nursing scholarship in your name at Arizona State University. We want to fund it with $500,000 to help students like you were, students who need support to pursue healthcare careers, and we want you to help administer it, if you're willing. Sarah's legs gave out. She sat down heavily in the visitor chair, the check clutched in her hands, tears streaming down her face. Additionally, Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger, I've spoken with the board of directors for Sunrise Springs. We're establishing a patient safety fund to encourage healthcare workers to report concerns without fear of retaliation. A fund that will protect whistleblowers, that will reward integrity. You'll be the first recipient, but not the last. I don't know what to say, Sarah whispered. Say you'll accept, David said. Say you'll let us do this small thing to repay a debt we can never really settle. Say you'll keep being exactly who you are, the kind of nurse who puts patients first, who speaks truth even when it's dangerous, who makes the healthcare system work the way it's supposed to. Sarah looked at the check again. $50,000. Enough to pay off Angela's medical debt. Enough to move to a better apartment. Enough to stop working double shifts, to breathe for the first time in years. I accept, she said finally, her voice breaking. And I promise I'll keep doing what's right, for every patient, every time. Harrison smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him in months. Then we're honored to know you, Sarah Johnson. The next weeks passed in a blur of media attention and legal proceedings. The case against Victoria Sterling and Marcus Chen made national news. Attempted murder of an elderly stroke patient by his son's fiancée for inheritance money, it had every element of a true crime sensation. News crews camped outside Sunrise Springs, interviewed patients and staff, turned Sarah into a reluctant celebrity. She hated the attention, the cameras, the reporters calling her a hero. She had done what any decent person should do, nothing more. But the story resonated, sparked conversations about elder abuse, about medical fraud, about the vulnerability of patients who trusted caregivers and family members. Victoria's trial was set for 6 months out. Prosecutors were confident of conviction, given the overwhelming evidence. Marcus had already accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Victoria in exchange for a reduced sentence. The case was, as one detective told Sarah, as close to airtight as they come. Sarah returned to work, to her night shifts, and her patients and her routine. But things had changed in ways both subtle and profound. She moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in a better neighborhood, closer to Sunrise Springs, with air conditioning that worked and carpet that was clean. She paid off Angela's medical debt and set up a savings account for future prescriptions. She bought herself new scrubs, comfortable shoes, and allowed herself the luxury of driving to work instead of taking the bus. But more than the financial changes, Sarah felt different inside. Lighter somehow, as if speaking the truth had lifted a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. She walked through Sunrise Springs with her head higher, her voice steadier. Other nurses approached her with concerns about patients, knowing she would listen, knowing she would act if necessary. The scholarship was established with a ceremony at ASU, where Sarah stood uncomfortable in a borrowed dress while university administrators praised her courage. The first recipient was a 20-year-old Filipino student working 2 jobs to afford nursing school, a girl who reminded Sarah so much of her younger self that she had to fight back tears during their meeting. David Whitmore recovered slowly from the betrayal, attending therapy, rebuilding his life, learning to trust again. He visited his father every day as Harrison completed his recovery, the two of them closer than they had been in years, united by surviving something that should have destroyed them. 6 months after the arrest, Victoria Sterling was convicted of attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole for 15. Marcus Chen received 12 years. The judge, in delivering the sentence, called Victoria's actions a calculated, cold-blooded attempt to murder a vulnerable elderly man for financial gain, demonstrating a complete absence of empathy or conscience. Sarah did not attend the sentencing. She was working a night shift, caring for a new patient recovering from heart surgery, doing the job she had always done. But when a colleague told her the verdict, she nodded, felt a deep satisfaction settle in her chest, and returned to her work. Harrison Whitmore made a full recovery. He returned home after 3 months in rehabilitation, walking with only a slight limp, his speech nearly normal. He threw a party to celebrate his recovery and to thank the staff of Sunrise Springs. Sarah attended reluctantly, uncomfortable with social situations, but Harrison insisted on introducing her to every guest as the nurse who saved my life and my son's future. David Whitmore eventually began dating again, cautiously, carefully, with better judgment about who to trust. He told Sarah once, during one of his father's follow-up appointments, "I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful to you. You gave me my father back. You saved me from destroying my life. How do you ever repay that?" "You don't," Sarah said simply. "You just live a good life. You be careful. You trust yourself. And if you ever see someone in danger, you help them the way I helped you. That's all the repayment anyone needs." On a quiet Tuesday night, almost exactly 1 year after she had overheard Victoria's phone call, Sarah stood in the same hallway outside the same consultation room, checking on a patient recovering from the same type of stroke Harrison had suffered. The night was silent except for familiar hospital sounds. The hallway was empty except for her. She thought about the girl she had been 1 year ago, exhausted, invisible, surviving day to day with no hope of anything changing. She thought about the moment of decision, the terrifying choice between safety and truth. She thought about what it had cost and what it had earned, and she thought about the fact that she would make the same choice again without hesitation, because some things mattered more than safety. Some things demanded everything and were worth the cost. Sarah Johnson had been just a night shift nurse with worn shoes and a tired back, and no reason to expect that her life would ever be anything more than survival. But she had chosen courage when it would have been easier to choose silence. She had chosen to protect someone who could not protect himself. She had chosen truth over fear, and in that choice, she had proven that heroism did not belong only to the powerful or the privileged, that the smallest voice could speak the most important truth, that integrity was not about what you did when people were watching, but about what you did in dark hallways at 3 in the morning when no one would ever know if you walked away. In the end, it was not wealth or status or beauty that had triumphed in this story, but simple human decency. It was not grand public gestures that had saved Harrison Whitmore, but a quiet act of conscience by a nurse who understood that caring for patients meant more than checking vital signs and administering medications. It meant standing between them and harm, even when that harm wore a beautiful face and a convincing smile. Sarah returned to the nurse's station, picked up her next patient chart, and continued her rounds. The night stretched ahead of her, full of work and responsibility. But now, instead of just surviving each shift, she moved through it with purpose, with the knowledge that what she did mattered, that she mattered, that one person choosing truth could change everything. And somewhere in Scottsdale, in a comfortable house with a garden and morning light streaming through windows, Harrison Whitmore sat reading the newspaper, alive because someone invisible had refused to stay silent. David Whitmore drove to work, his heart still learning to trust, but no longer broken, saved from ruin by a nurse who had risked everything for his future. They lived because Sarah Johnson had understood the most fundamental truth of caregiving, that every patient deserves protection, that every life has value, and that silence in the face of evil is complicity. The scholarship bearing her name would send dozens of nurses into the world, each one carrying forward the lessons Sarah had taught. That healthcare is not just science and procedure, but moral courage. That the oath to do no harm extends beyond avoiding mistakes to actively preventing them, even when prevention is dangerous. And in hospitals and rehabilitation centers across the country, night shift nurses would hear Maria's story and understand that they were not invisible, that their observations mattered, that their voices could save lives if they found the courage to speak. Sarah Johnson had been just a night shift nurse with calloused hands and worn shoes and a back that ached from years of lifting patients who could not lift themselves. But she had chosen truth when lies were safer. She had chosen to protect when silence was easier. She had chosen to risk everything for people who could not protect themselves. And in that choice, she had proven that real heroism lives not in grand public gestures, but in quiet moments of conscience when no one is watching. That courage belongs not to those with the most to gain, but to those with the most to lose who act anyway. That the heart willing to sacrifice for others will always find light, no matter how deep the darkness. This is Fortune Tales. If you watch this far, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. It means everything to us. Like and share to more people, and tell us where you are watching from.